The desert sun had not yet reached its highest point, but the heat already felt merciless, pressing down on the town square like a hand trying to smother a cry. Dust swirled lazily through the air, as if even the wind was too tired to fight anymore. And there she was, no longer a child, not yet fully a woman, shackled at the wrists and ankles, standing on a crude wooden block as though her life were nothing more than a bargain to be shouted over. The iron chains bit into her skin, leaving raw marks that spoke louder than any words. She had been owned, traded, beaten, reduced to a number. The crowd gathered not out of compassion but curiosity. Men leaned on rifles, boots caked in mud, spitting tobacco and laughing like the sight of a girl in chains was a kind of theater. A few women stood at the edges, faces expressionless, their silence louder than the jeers. Someone called out, "$2! She ain't worth more than that!" And the laughter rolled across the square like thunder. The auctioneer grinned, the kind of grin that made cruelty look casual, and slammed his hand against the block as if sealing her fate with a nail. And then he appeared. The rancher, weathered face hidden beneath the brim of a dust-stained hat, boots worn from miles of solitude, eyes darkened by years of silence. He didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He just looked. Looked at her the way no one else had all day, as if she were still human, still something beyond the chains and humiliation. The town had long ago learned to ignore suffering, but in that moment, his silence carried more weight than their mockery. With $2, he broke the rhythm of cruelty. He didn't buy a slave. He bought her breath, her chance, the possibility of a future no one else believed she deserved. The sound of the auctioneer's hand, slamming against the block, still echoed in the air when the rancher's voice cut through the jeers like a blade through rope. $2, he said, low but steady. The crowd went quiet for a breath, not out of respect but disbelief. Was that really it? $2? Some men snorted, others laughed even harder, kicking the dust as though this was the funniest thing they'd seen in months. A girl in chains, bought like a sack of potatoes. But the rancher didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, pulled out 2 silver coins worn from years of hard use, and dropped them into the auctioneer's palm. The clink of metal was louder than the laughter. The auctioneer shrugged, half disappointed, half relieved to be rid of her, and shoved the girl off the block. She stumbled forward, shackles clanking, falling into the dirt like a discarded tool. Nobody offered to help. Nobody cared. Except the rancher. He bent down, slow and deliberate, and lifted her up with a strength that was neither rough nor tender but steady. Steady enough to make her believe for the first time in years that someone might not break her. He didn't say a word as he cut the chains with a file he carried on his saddlebag. Each strike of metal against iron was like a promise, like the sound of a man undoing the cruelty of others with his own bare will. When the last shackle fell, the girl didn't thank him. She couldn't. Her lips trembled, her throat dry, her eyes too full of a storm she hadn't dared release. "Come on," he muttered. "We ride." The rancher led her to his horse, a weathered bay that had carried him through storms, droughts, and nights colder than death itself. He hoisted her onto the saddle and climbed up behind, his arms forming a silent wall against the world. The crowd watched, some spitting, some cursing under their breath. No one stopped him. They didn't need to. They knew the desert would finish what they started. The ride back to his ranch was long, stretched beneath a sky turning red with the last breath of the sun. The girl didn't speak, didn't even look around. Her body leaned slightly against his chest, more out of exhaustion than trust. The rancher didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He knew enough. She was broken, and the world wanted her forgotten. At the ranch, silence greeted them. The land stretched wide, empty, almost as lonely as the man who owned it. He dismounted, helped her down, and guided her into the small cabin he called home. It was nothing grand, rough timber walls, a single table, a bed that creaked with every shift of weight. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was hers now, if only for tonight. He poured her water, set bread on the table. She stared at it, suspicious, as though kindness itself were a trick. Slowly, she lifted the cup, drank, then ate, her hands trembling not from hunger but from disbelief. The rancher sat across from her, saying nothing, his eyes steady, waiting. For the first time she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why? The rancher leaned back, the chair groaning beneath his weight. He thought about the question, about the truth. Why had he done it? Why spend the last coins he had on a girl who might bring nothing but trouble? Finally, he answered, simple and sharp as a bullet. Because no one else would. The words hung heavy between them. She lowered her gaze, tears cutting lines down her dirt-streaked face. She had been bought, sold, used, and discarded. But this man, this stranger, had chosen differently. Not because he wanted her, not because he saw profit, but because he refused to walk away. That night, as the desert wind rattled the shutters, the girl lay on the rancher's bed while he took the floor. She couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood, every howl of the coyotes outside pulled her back into memory. She saw flames, chains, faces of men who had carved her past into a nightmare. She knew they would come again. But when she turned her head and saw the rancher's silhouette in the dim glow of the dying fire, sitting upright with his rifle across his knees, she felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not yet. But the first fragile spark of it. And in the silence of that cabin, under the weight of everything unspoken, the story of the shackled girl and the lonely rancher truly began. If this story gripped your heart, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to keep these voices alive, subscribe to follow more Wild West tales, and share this video so others can feel the dust, the chains, and the courage that still echoes across the frontier. The West was never just about land. It was about people, about choices, and about the fight to see each other as human. Ride with us and let these Wild West tales remind us what dignity is worth. The desert night pressed heavy against the cabin walls, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow even memory. The girl lay stiff on the bed, her body trembling under the thin quilt. But it wasn't the cold that shook her. It was the weight of silence, the kind that let old ghosts creep back into the room. The rancher sat by the fire, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the shadows that flickered and danced against the walls. He didn't speak, didn't push her to. He just waited, steady as stone, letting the crackle of the fire fill the spaces between them. But the girl could feel his presence, and it pulled at something deep inside her. Something long, buried under chains and fear. Finally, her voice broke the quiet, fragile as glass. They'll come for me. The rancher didn't move. His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the fire. Who? She swallowed hard, as though the word itself carried thorns. Men, riders. They owned me. The rancher turned his head now, his gaze cutting through the dim light, and for the first time she saw it. Not pity, not even surprise, but a grim understanding. He'd known men like that before. Men who branded people like cattle. Men who believed chains made them gods. Her hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the blanket and pulled it tight around her shoulders. They burned my village. My father fought, but they killed him. My mother too. They took me because... She hesitated, shame flooding her face. Maybe because they said I'd fetch a good price, strong enough to work, young enough to be broken. The words fell heavy, dragging the air down with them. The rancher said nothing. He knew there was nothing he could say to unmake her scars. She lifted her arm, sleeve falling back, to reveal deep, raw grooves across her wrists. Every link of that chain carved me into something I don't even recognize anymore. Her eyes locked on his, burning with a fire that was equal parts fury and despair. Do you know what it's like to pray for death, and then wake up praying for life in the same breath? The rancher didn't answer right away. His silence wasn't dismissal. It was the silence of a man who carried his own graves inside. He leaned forward, set another log on the fire, and finally spoke. I know enough. Her breath caught, her voice breaking as she went on. They marked me. She turned her shoulder, pulling the torn fabric of her dress aside. Faint in the firelight, a brand scar twisted across her skin, jagged, cruel, a signature of ownership no human should ever bear. They said this means I'm theirs, forever, that no matter where I run, the mark will call them back to me. The rancher's hand tightened on the rifle, knuckles white. He didn't curse, didn't rage. But the storm in his eyes said enough. She leaned back, her voice dropping to a whisper. By midnight, they'll come. They always do. No one escapes, not for long. For a moment, the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward like fleeting stars. The girl's gaze followed them, and when she looked back down, tears had already carved lines across her dirt-stained cheeks. You should have left me there. You should have walked away. The rancher stood, slow and deliberate, the floor creaking under his boots. He crossed the room and stopped at the window, staring out into the vast black stretch of the desert. Nothing stirred yet, but he could feel it, the weight of riders somewhere out there, carried by the night. When he turned back to her, his voice was low, heavy as the iron he'd cut from her wrists. I don't walk away. The girl's lips parted, but no words came. She studied him, searching for some hint of why, of what he wanted in return. But all she found was a man carved out of solitude, someone who had buried his own heart long ago and still chose to act. The fire sank lower, shadows crawling longer across the floorboards. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself and whispered, almost to herself, "Then you'll die because of me." The rancher moved back to the chair, lowering himself with the same steady weight as before. He rested the rifle across his knees again and glanced at her with eyes that held no hesitation. Then so be it. The words settled into her chest like a stone, but not the kind that dragged her under. This one anchored her, held her still against the storm. For the first time since her village burned, since the chains clamped shut, she felt something stronger than fear. It was not safety, not yet. But it was the first spark of belonging, fragile and trembling, in the heart of a night that promised blood before dawn. Midnight came not with silence, but with the kind of stillness that warns of violence. The desert seemed to hold its breath, and in that pause, the girl felt her chest tighten. She sat upright on the bed, eyes wide in the dim firelight, every nerve in her body remembering the sound before it came. Hooves, distant at first, then clearer, pounding against the earth like war drums. The rancher rose to his feet before she even spoke. He'd heard them too. His hand moved to the rifle, steady, practiced, as though his entire life had been leading to this moment. He didn't look afraid. He looked ready. They're here, the girl whispered, her voice shaking. The rancher glanced at her just once, his expression unreadable under the shadow of his hat brim. Stay down, don't move unless I say. The wind carried the sound closer, metal jangling, men shouting low to each other, the cruel bark of laughter. The kind of laughter that knew ownership, that fed on the suffering of others. The girl pressed herself against the wall, pulling the quilt to her chest as if thin cloth could keep the night from swallowing her whole. Through the cracked window, lanterns flared in the distance, weaving across the horizon like fireflies born of hatred. Then came the shapes. Riders, 10, maybe more, their horses restless, their guns gleaming when the moonlight caught. One voice rose above the others, rough and mocking. Cain, we know you're in there. Hand over the girl, and maybe we let you keep breathing. The rancher stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand, the firelight at his back throwing him into silhouette. He didn't shout. His voice was flat, heavy as lead. She's not yours to take. A ripple of laughter came from the riders, sharp and cruel. Not ours? Hell, she's marked. She'll always be ours. $2 don't change that. The girl flinched at the words, pulling her knees to her chest. The brand on her shoulder seemed to burn again, as though those men had reached across the night to remind her she was nothing but property in their eyes. The rancher lifted the rifle and fired. The crack tore the night in two. One lantern shattered, plunging the riders into chaos as horses reared and curses split the air. The girl gasped, clapping her hands over her ears, the sound both terrifying and liberating. For once, a shot had been fired for her, not against her. Cain, the voice snarled, furious now. You just signed your own death. Bullets answered him, slamming into the wood of the cabin, tearing splinters across the room. The girl ducked low, covering her head, while the rancher returned fire with the cold precision of a man who had seen too many battles to waste a single round. Each pull of the trigger was measured, deliberate, and when a scream cut through the night, she realized he wasn't just shooting. He was striking fear. But there were too many. The thundering of boots on dry ground drew closer. Shadows moved against the walls as men dismounted, circling like wolves. The rancher slammed the door shut and shoved the heavy table against it. His chest rose and fell, slow but unyielding. He turned to her, eyes burning. "They'll try to burn us out. You need to be ready." Her lips parted, trembling. "Ready? I can't fight them. They'll kill us both." His gaze softened, just for a heartbeat. "You survived them once. That makes you stronger than they'll ever be." The words cut through her terror, not as comfort, but as truth. She remembered the flames that took her village, the chains that carved her skin, the nights she prayed for death. She was still here, alive. And though fear gripped her, something else began to stir beneath it. Anger, raw and sharp. Outside, the riders shouted, their voices dripping with certainty. "We'll burn your ranch to the ground, Cain. Nothing left but ashes and bones." The girl felt her hands curl into fists. The rancher saw it. He nodded once, firm, as if to tell her, "Yes. Hold on to that fire." The night erupted again. Windows shattered, smoke poured in, flames catching on the dry wood of the shutters. The girl coughed, eyes stinging. But when she looked at the rancher, calm, rifle steady, jaw set like stone, she drew in a breath that wasn't just fear anymore. It was defiance. She crawled to the corner where he kept spare ammunition, her fingers trembling as she pushed the box toward him. The rancher glanced at her, and for the first time, something flickered across his hardened face. A shadow of respect. "Good," he muttered, loading another round. The fire roared higher outside, the men circling closer, their boots pounding against the dirt like thunder. The girl pressed herself against the wall, every muscle taut. For so long she had been nothing but a victim, a thing to be sold, used, discarded. Tonight, the world wanted to remind her of that. But as the rancher raised his rifle once more, standing like a lone sentinel against the tide, she realized something had changed. This time, she wasn't alone. And when the first man kicked the door, when the hinges screamed and the flames licked higher, she didn't close her eyes. She was ready to face the night. The door shuddered again, harder this time, the hinges screaming as if they knew they wouldn't survive another blow. The girl pressed her back to the wall, smoke stinging her eyes, her heart slamming against her ribs. Outside, the riders jeered, their voices full of drunken certainty. They had broken towns before. They had branded bodies and buried names. To them, this was already won. The rancher didn't move from his place at the center of the room. His rifle leveled at the door, his stance unshaken. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of the land itself, rooted, immovable, carved from dust and years of silence. Then the door splintered. A boot crashed through, then another, and the wood gave way in a violent burst. The first rider surged inside, pistol raised. He barely had time to register the dim firelight before the rancher's rifle roared. The man fell hard, his body jerking as the smoke filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and blood. Chaos followed. More boots thundered on the porch, more voices snarling curses. Bullets tore through the walls, ripping wood into jagged teeth. The girl ducked low, covering her head. But when she looked up, she saw something she hadn't expected. The rancher wasn't fighting for himself. Every bullet, every shot, was angled between her and the storm outside. He had placed himself as her shield, and nothing, not fire, not steel, not death, was going to move him. "Reload!" he barked, tossing the spent casing aside. Her hands shook as she scrambled for the ammunition box, sliding rounds across the table toward him. The simple act steadied her, the way it rooted her in the fight. She wasn't just cowering anymore. She was part of it. Another rider lunged through the smoke, his face twisted in fury. This time, the girl didn't freeze. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth and swung with every ounce of rage that had been carved into her by chains. The poker struck his arm, the pistol flying free as he howled in pain. The rancher's boot met his chest, sending him crashing back through the doorway. The girl stood there, chest heaving, her hands still gripping the iron. The rancher's eyes flicked to her, and in that fleeting second, something passed between them. Not just survival, recognition. Outside, the riders faltered. They had expected an easy reclaiming of their property. Instead, two figures inside that cabin stood against them, refusing to bow, refusing to break. Rage replaced certainty. They set fire to the porch, determined to smoke their prey out. The flames climbed fast, licking at the beams, sparks falling onto the floorboards. The girl coughed, choking on the thick black haze. The rancher pulled her close, covering her mouth with a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve. His voice was low, fierce. "We hold until they bleed. Do you understand?" She nodded, eyes fierce despite the smoke. The battle turned brutal. The rancher fired until his shoulder ached, until each squeeze of the trigger felt like hammering nails into fate itself. The girl swung, pushed, fought beside him, the terror in her chest burning into something new. Anger, raw and defiant. Every time another rider fell, she felt the chains of her past snap, one by one. At last, when the smoke thinned for a moment, silence stretched across the desert. The riders pulled back, dragging their wounded, their curses fading into the distance. They hadn't won. They hadn't broken her. The rancher lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, sweat and soot streaking his face. He looked at her, filthy, trembling, but standing. She had fought. She had lived. "They'll come again," she whispered, voice hoarse. He nodded, sliding another round into the chamber with deliberate calm. "Then we'll be ready." The cabin was scarred, the air heavy with ash and blood. But within those battered walls, something unshakable had been born. A bond. Not of possession, not of pity, but of choice. He had chosen to fight for her. She had chosen to fight with him. And as the desert night surrendered to the faintest glow of dawn, the girl knew her past would always chase her. But she also knew she wasn't running alone anymore. If this moment gripped you, if you felt the fire, the smoke, the clash between cruelty and defiance, don't let the story stop here. Hit like to honor these voices, subscribe to join us for more Wild West tales, and share this story so others can feel the dust and the fight of a world that refused to bow. The frontier was never just about land. It was about courage, about standing when silence was easier. Ride with us. The Wild West tales are just beginning. Dawn bled across the desert, painting the horizon in ash and crimson. The cabin still smoldered, its walls scarred, but it stood, just like them. The girl sat on the steps, bruised yet unbroken, while the rancher tightened his saddle, eyes scanning the endless horizon. She knew the riders would return, hungrier, angrier. Yet fear no longer defined her. For the first time since chains claimed her, she had something stronger than survival: choice. When she rose and stepped beside the rancher, the silence between them spoke louder than vows. Whatever came, they would face it together.